May 20th, 1942. Station HYPO, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a dimly lit basement beneath the administrative offices at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer held in his hands a decoded Japanese transmission that could influence the trajectory of the Pacific conflict. The message, still fresh from the decryption machines, detailed the composition of the Japanese attack force at AF, 2 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and a number of accompanying destroyers. Exhausted and sleep-deprived, Dyer's eyes blurred as he absorbed the intelligence extracted from the daily stream of intercepted communications. Operational Order 14 outlined Admiral Yamamoto's strategy for what the Japanese anticipated would be a decisive engagement. The information had been painstakingly extracted from JN-25, the Imperial Navy's most advanced cipher, a code the Japanese considered unbreakable. Commanding the effort was Commander Joseph John Rochefort, whose unkempt appearance, slippers and a long worn bathrobe, belied the sharp intellect behind the operation. His office placard humorously warned, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." Beneath the informal exterior, Rochefort directed a team that had accomplished what the Japanese believed was impossible: systematic penetration of JN-25. Unknown to Tokyo, this breach would initiate a prolonged intelligence disaster for the Imperial Navy, as they remained unaware of the compromise for months to come. The cryptoanalytic team, working in a space nicknamed the Dungeon for its lack of heat and ventilation, processed hundreds of Japanese messages daily. By late May, the workload had increased as the build-up to Midway intensified, with analysts rapidly decoding and cataloging critical communications. The Japanese, confident in their code's security, continued transmitting sensitive operational plans, unaware that U.S. Navy cryptanalysts were monitoring each message. JN-25 had been implemented on June 1, 1939, replacing an older naval cipher system from 1931. Japanese naval cryptographers in the 4th Department regarded it as the apex of secure communication, a 2-tiered system of such complexity that successful decryption seemed beyond human or mechanical capability. The initial codebook contained roughly 30,000 5-digit code groups. By 1942, this had expanded to nearly 45,000, each divisible by 3 to allow error checking during transmission. This mathematical feature, intended to reduce mistakes, inadvertently offered American analysts a crucial entry point into the cipher. The JN-25 encryption process first converted words and phrases into numerical groups using an extensive codebook. These groups were then obscured with a second layer of protection: false addition through randomly chosen numbers from separate additive tables containing up to 50,000 options. The dual system was designed to create an almost infinite number of possible permutations, rendering brute force analysis impractical by contemporary standards. Captain Ito Tsuno, who oversaw the creation of JN-25, later acknowledged during post-war interviews that the Japanese Navy had considered the code virtually impenetrable. With tens of thousands of code groups combined with an enormous set of additives, the number of possible combinations was beyond the computational capacity of any nation at the time. Yet, the Japanese misjudged one critical factor: persistent methodical cryptanalysis, coupled with subtle structural vulnerabilities in the cipher, would allow American analysts to reconstruct key elements of JN-25, setting the stage for decisive strategic advantage in the months ahead. Before the onset of World War II, few could have predicted that American cryptanalysts would turn commercial tabulating devices, machines originally designed by IBM for census compilation and business accounting, into tools capable of sophisticated code breaking. These devices could rapidly sift through vast arrays of possibilities, detect subtle patterns invisible to the human eye, and execute computations in hours that would otherwise take teams of mathematicians months or even years to complete manually. When the Japanese Navy transitioned from the JN-25A to the JN-25B cipher on December 1, 1940, just over a year before the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. codebreakers were confronted with a staggering setback. Months of painstaking work became obsolete overnight, forcing analysts to reconstruct their understanding of the new system from the ground up, all while tensions escalated across the Pacific. By the morning of December 7, 1941, the team at Station HYPO had managed to decrypt only a fraction, approximately 10 to 15% of intercepted communications. This limited success provided some indication of rising Japanese naval activity, but offered no concrete warning of the impending assault. Station HYPO itself was described by visitors as one of the most oppressive military workplaces in the Pacific Theater. Located in a windowless basement, the environment was dim, airless, and heavy with the haze of cigarette smoke from relentless analysts. Amidst the constant mechanical hum of IBM machines, newcomers often found the conditions physically and mentally taxing. Yet despite these hardships, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort had assembled what Admiral Chester Nimitz would later refer to as one of the most significant intelligence units in naval history. The team, never numbering more than 50 at its peak during the Midway crisis, consisted of some of the Navy's brightest minds. Among them, Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright stood out for his mathematical prowess, often working through complex problems for 2 days at a stretch on little more than coffee and sheer resolve. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, famously nicknamed the Babe Ruth of codebreaking for his uncanny ability to crack ciphers, survived the Pearl Harbor attack aboard the USS Tennessee. The destruction he witnessed fueled a relentless focus on cryptanalysis, culminating in his pivotal work on the Japanese date-time cipher, an accomplishment involving correlating intercepted weather reports with the hidden numerical overlays protecting operational schedules. Marine Major Alva Redwell, who had not completed formal schooling but possessed an extraordinary intuitive grasp of Japanese linguistic patterns, served as chief translator, tirelessly decoding messages beneath the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, often with a cigar clenched between his teeth. Commander Thomas Dyer, another mathematical prodigy, embodied the intellectual intensity of the station. Accounts describe him emerging from exhaustive sessions with bloodshot eyes and an unkempt appearance, revealing the physical toll exacted by long hours of concentrated effort. By May 1942, Station HYPO's analysts had managed to reconstruct sufficient elements of JN-25B to interpret roughly 40% of Japanese transmissions. Although this fell short of complete word-for-word translations, it allowed for effective gisting, extracting the general meaning and strategic significance of enemy communications. The innovative use of IBM equipment for cryptanalysis represented a profound technological leap that Japanese code designers had never anticipated. Station HYPO operated IBM 601 multiplying punches alongside sorters, collators, tabulators, and key punch machines, capable of processing thousands of punch cards per hour, each card containing 80 columns of encoded information from intercepted messages. The breakthrough came from systematic recognition of operator habits. Dyer discovered that Japanese radio operators, despite explicit instructions to begin encoding at random points within the cipher tables, often defaulted to predictable starting positions, such as page 1, line 1, providing consistent patterns for the IBM machines to exploit. A notable example occurred in April 1942, when an IBM run revealed recurring code groups at the start of messages. Ham Wright proposed that these repetitions likely represented numerical identifiers, reflecting the Japanese practice of beginning communications with message numbers, such as message 473. This combination of human error, mechanical precision, and analytical ingenuity laid the foundation for critical intelligence gains that would shape the outcome of naval engagements in the Pacific. Analysis of previously captured Japanese diplomatic ciphers confirmed the hypothesis advanced by Wright. The Japanese military was still employing a numeral encoding scheme that had been considered outdated years earlier. The Navy's ingenuity in modifying commercial IBM machines for cryptanalysis purposes was extraordinary. By the spring of 1941, specialized machines had been commissioned specifically for code breaking, featuring more than 75 custom attachments tailored to cryptographic tasks. These devices could perform in-depth examinations of intercepted messages, rapidly detecting instances where identical additive sequences were reused, operations that would have consumed days of manual effort. A report from the Navy highlighted the efficiency gains. While an experienced cryptanalyst might spend approximately 10 hours comparing two messages of 200 characters each by hand, the adapted IBM equipment could complete the same analysis in fewer than 3 minutes. The financial and logistical commitment was immense. The Navy was investing hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to rent and modify IBM machines, and the energy demands of these devices were so substantial that Station HYPO required a dedicated electrical supply to support them. Without this technological infrastructure, cracking the Japanese JN-25 code would have been virtually unattainable. Confidence in JN-25 within the Imperial Japanese Navy was nearly absolute. Senior cryptographic officer Commander Yamamoto would later attest that Japanese planners assumed the Americans lacked the linguistic proficiency to conduct serious cryptanalysis of their communications. The Navy believed that the combination of complex mathematical schemes and Japanese language skills would deter any attempt at code breaking. A 1941 intelligence assessment by the Naval General Staff claimed that fewer than 100 Americans were capable of translating Japanese for military purposes, and that no individual possessed the dual expertise in language and mathematics necessary for effective cryptanalysis. History proved these assessments catastrophically wrong. The United States Navy had long invested in cultivating officers with high-level Japanese proficiency, beginning intensive training in the 1920s and sending them abroad to acquire near-native fluency. The Japanese overestimated the protective power of mathematical complexity while neglecting human factors that introduce vulnerabilities. Radio operators under pressure often relied on procedural shortcuts. Clerks, fatigued by repetitive tasks, began encoding messages from predictable starting points. Meteorological reports followed rigid schedules and formatting, and supply officers routinely transmitted requests using formulaic language. Each of these recurring elements provided cryptanalysts with valuable cribs, known or predictable plaintext that could unlock entire messages. Compounding these weaknesses was the Japanese Navy's institutional inflexibility. The same hierarchical culture that fostered loyalty and discipline also discouraged scrutiny of operational security protocols. Routine procedures were rarely questioned, leaving systemic vulnerabilities unaddressed. In combination, technological overconfidence, rigid organizational culture, and predictable human behavior created openings that U.S. cryptanalysts were able to exploit systematically, ultimately undermining the presumed inviolability of JN-25. During the early months of 1942, the Japanese Navy frequently attributed the uncanny precision of American defensive maneuvers to superior reconnaissance rather than to the compromise of their communications. Instances such as U.S. carriers appearing at exactly the right defensive locations or submarines positioned along hidden approaches were consistently interpreted as remarkable operational foresight. Post-war interviews revealed the depth of this misconception. Admiral Fukudomi Shigeru, Chief of Staff under Admiral Yamamoto, later recounted that even after receiving confirmation that Americans had been intercepting Japanese codes, many officers remained convinced that espionage, not cryptanalysis, was the explanation. A turning point for Japanese code security occurred on April 28, 1942, when Station HYPO intercepted a message that immediately drew the attention of its analysts. The transmission instructed Japanese forces to complete preparations and remain on standby for orders, with the target designated simply as AF. Lieutenant Rashford, who had been monitoring repeated references to AF, recognized the term from prior operational communications, noting its association with movements near Midway. Nevertheless, correlation alone was insufficient evidence. Intelligence officers in Washington, including those at OP-20-G, speculated that AF could refer to the Aleutian Islands or even to Hawaii itself. This ambiguity created tension within U.S. naval leadership as Admiral Nimitz sought definitive confirmation. The breakthrough came through the initiative of Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, a retired submarine officer recalled to service despite arthritis. Holmes understood that Midway's strategic vulnerability lay in its dependence on a single desalination facility for fresh water. On May 19th, Rashford proposed an ingenious deception plan to Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer. Using the secure underwater cable connecting Pearl Harbor to Midway, impervious to Japanese interception, the Midway garrison would broadcast a deliberately false distress signal claiming a catastrophic failure at the water plant. The plan was executed on May 20th. Midway transmitted the fabricated emergency over radio channels routinely monitored by the Japanese. Within a day, Japanese intelligence at the code monitoring station Quadaline intercepted the message and relayed it through the JN-25 system to Combined Fleet Headquarters. When Station HYPO decoded the subsequent Japanese report on May 22nd, the result confirmed beyond doubt both the identity of the target as Midway and the fact that the Americans were reading current Japanese operational traffic. The Japanese had fully fallen for the ruse, never questioning why such sensitive information would be broadcast in plain language.
While knowing the target was critical, Admiral Nimitz also needed accurate timing. Japanese transmissions included super and cipher date-time indicators which had been encrypted separately before being incorporated into JN-25 messages. These additional layers of security had long frustrated U.S. cryptanalysts. The solution emerged from careful examination of Japanese meteorological communications. Joseph Finnegan observed that weather stations transmitted their observations at highly consistent times, with each report including the exact date and hour. By comparing hundreds of these messages against known transmission schedules, Finnegan and his colleague Wright gradually constructed a system to convert the super-enciphered date-time groups into readable dates. This method finally revealed the critical timeline. On May 24, analysts intercepted a message from Admiral Yamamoto specifying that operations would commence on June 4 at 0200 Tokyo time, with the invasion force arriving on June 7th, 3 days after the carrier strike. Reviewing the decrypts, Edwin Layton delivered a precise assessment to Admiral Nimitz. The Japanese attack on Midway would begin on June 4, approaching from the northwest at a bearing of 325 degrees, with aircraft launching from a point 175 miles from the island at 0400 local time. Nimitz's response reflected full confidence in the intelligence. Any discrepancies would not exceed 5 minutes, 5 degrees, or 5 miles. On June 4, 1942, at 0534 local time, a PBY Catalina confirmed the Japanese carrier force approaching from 320 degrees at 180 miles out, virtually matching the predicted position. The culmination of Station HYPO's intelligence came on May 20 with the decryption of Operational Order 14, a massive 12-part message detailing Yamamoto's complete plan for the Midway engagement. The intercepted instructions included force composition, coordination between the Midway strike and the Aleutian diversion, and precise timing of all maneuvers. The first carrier strike group under Admiral Nagumo, consisting of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would deploy 248 aircraft. The invasion contingent included 5,000 troops aboard 12 transports, while the supporting fleet featured 7 battleships, including Yamato, the largest ever constructed. Early May intercepts confirmed that 2 of Japan's newest carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea, would be absent, reducing Japanese carrier strength from 6 to 4 and markedly improving American prospects. Additional decrypted communications on May 13th revealed submarine patrol deployments, specifying that Submarine Squadron 3 would establish a screen 150 miles northwest of Hawaii by 2 days prior to the expected attack. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Nimitz ordered U.S. carriers to depart Pearl Harbor on May 28 and 30, thus avoiding Japanese submarine lines by June 2nd. Intercepted Japanese logistics communications revealed the extraordinary scale of their operational planning. One particular message detailed fuel allocations, indicating that the tanker group would deliver 2,800 tons of heavy oil and 1,200 tons of aviation fuel at coordinates 30 degrees north, 170 degrees east, 3 days later. These data points not only confirmed the timing of Japanese movements, but also highlighted the extreme strain on their supply lines, demonstrating the limits of their logistical reach. Despite the clarity of these insights, not all analysts in Washington accepted the interpretations emerging from Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, the Navy's primary cryptanalytic center, was openly critical of the methods employed by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort. While Rochefort relied heavily on linguistic acumen and interpretive intuition to identify Japanese intentions, Redman insisted that rigorous mathematical analysis should underpin any intelligence conclusions. The influence of the Redman family within naval intelligence extended further. John Redman in cryptanalysis and his brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, as Director of Naval Communications, were able to secure considerable sway over naval policy. They persuaded Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations, that Rochefort's unorthodox approach was unreliable, presenting intelligence that bypassed established channels and potentially misled Fleet Command. On May 14, 1942, OP-20G issued a formal assessment suggesting that the Japanese target was likely the Aleutian Islands, with a secondary possibility being the western United States. They criticized Station HYPO for seeing patterns where none might not exist, framing the analyses as wishful interpretations of ambiguous intercepts. This bureaucratic clash threatened to derail preparations for the defense of Midway. Admiral King's natural skepticism of Rochefort's informal style and direct communication with Admiral Nimitz initially inclined him to favor the centralized Washington analysis. It was only through Nimitz's direct intervention, coupled with the compelling evidence of Midway's water shortages, that Rochefort's judgment prevailed.
Even after Midway confirmed Rochefort's intelligence, the Redman brothers remained intent on undermining him, portraying the victory as mere fortune rather than the result of analytical skill. By October 1942, Rochefort was reassigned to supervise a floating dry dock, an ignominious posting that contrasted sharply with his pivotal role in orchestrating the success at Midway. Breaking the Japanese naval code, JN-25, required exceptional international coordination. The FECB, originally established in Hong Kong in 1935, had achieved the first breakthroughs on JN-25 as early as 1939. John Tiltman at Bletchley Park had identified key structural features, including the divisibility of code groups by 3, which signaled valid messages. When Japan introduced the JN-25B version on December 1, 1940, British cryptanalysts were able to make immediate gains. Although the codebook had changed, the additive tables remained consistent, allowing messages encoded in late November and early December to be partially decrypted by comparing old and new messages. By March 1941, FECB had reconstructed nearly 3,000 code groups, which were shared with American counterparts. The Dutch also contributed significantly through the work of Kamer 14 at Bandung Technical College in Java, led by Lieutenant Commander Leo Brouwer. The Dutch had monitored Japanese naval communications since 1936, developing specialized expertise in Japanese radio procedures. After Java fell to Japanese forces in March 1942, Brouwer and his team escaped to Australia, bringing with them boxes of punch cards containing partially decoded messages. Station CAST, located in Corregidor, made a crucial determination before its evacuation. In March 1942, personnel confirmed that AF was the Japanese code for Midway.
This intelligence was transmitted to Station HYPO just before CAST's evacuation by submarine. The 74 members of CAST were considered so vital that their extraction occurred in multiple submarine missions from February through April 1942. They eventually reconstituted as FUMA in Melbourne, demonstrating remarkable continuity despite the operational upheaval. The coordination among these dispersed units was striking, given the vast distances and limited communication technology. Decoded messages were transmitted via secure cable, recovered code groups were sent through diplomatic pouches, and interception schedules were carefully aligned to prevent gaps in coverage. By May 1942, Allied forces intercepted approximately 60% of Japanese naval radio transmissions, although only about 40% of these could be successfully decrypted. The Imperial Japanese Navy's failure to recognize that JN-25 was compromised reflected deep institutional weaknesses rather than mere overconfidence. Intelligence and communications were split between the 3rd Department, Intelligence, and 4th Department, Communications, creating bureaucratic barriers that prevented a unified assessment of operational security. Captain Itaro Tachibana, head of the 3rd Department's American section, later acknowledged, "We had no mechanism to correlate operational failures with possible compromises of our codes." When American forces appeared at ideal positions, the Operations Department blamed inadequate reconnaissance. The possibility that our communications were being read never entered our calculations. Compounding this vulnerability, Japanese security protocols inadvertently facilitated Allied code-breaking. Standard operating procedure required message originators to include full titles and unit designations, providing critical contextual clues that made cryptanalysis significantly more feasible. Repetition in Japanese communications often provided inadvertent clues, as routine acknowledgments would reiterate essential elements of prior messages. Similarly, daily weather reports transmitted at fixed hours created predictable reference points or cribs that codebreakers could exploit. Lapses in operational security also went largely unrecognized. A notable instance occurred on January 20, 1942, when a Japanese submarine sank in shallow waters off Darwin. It carried current codebooks, which, under normal circumstances, should have prompted immediate alarm about potential compromise. Australian divers, however, retrieved significant cryptographic materials, which were promptly shared with American codebreakers. Despite this, the Japanese assumed the codes were secure, believing the submarine's depth would prevent recovery, an assumption that proved dangerously inaccurate.
In a separate incident, on June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a report revealing information that, under ordinary circumstances, could have severely damaged U.S. intelligence operations. Reporter Stanley Johnston, who had survived the sinking of the carrier Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea, described details that were accessible only through successful code-breaking: the composition of Japanese naval forces, ship names, and operational plans. The publication provoked outrage in Washington. President Roosevelt reportedly considered legal action under the Espionage Act, while Navy Secretary Frank Knox advocated for a court-martial against the newspaper's publisher, Colonel Robert McCormick. Formal charges were drafted that could have led to severe penalties, including death. Miraculously, the Japanese apparently remained unaware of the disclosure. No reports of the article reached their intelligence services through their own agents, diplomatic channels, or even German intermediaries. The event, which should have prompted immediate modifications to the JN-25 code, passed without detection. Ultimately, the Navy abandoned prosecution, ensuring the Tribune remained unpunished, and crucially, American code-breaking operations stayed confidential. For the analysts at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, the victory at Midway did not bring relief, but rather intensified the psychological pressure. They were acutely aware that the Japanese would eventually alter their codes, which could render American intelligence blind at a critical moment. Each day that JN-25 messages remained decipherable represented a fleeting advantage, fraught with enormous responsibility. The analysts could predict convoy movements, submarine patrols, and invasion targets, information capable of saving thousands of lives. However, operational use of such intelligence required careful concealment to avoid revealing the source. Procedures established by Captain Joseph Rochefort mandated strict attribution protocols. Intelligence derived from decrypts had to appear to come from other sources, submarine sightings, captured documents, or routine reconnaissance. The toll on personnel was severe. Lieutenant Thomas Dyer suffered from chronic insomnia, seeing code groups even in his sleep. Wesley Wright experienced persistent anxiety, fearing each day might bring a code change that would nullify their work. Joseph Finnegan turned to alcohol, haunted by Japanese messages describing American prisoners which he could not act upon without exposing the source. A striking example of the power and risks of code-breaking occurred with the operation to assassinate Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943. In early April, American codebreakers intercepted a JN-25D message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour in the Solomon Islands. This intelligence posed a difficult dilemma. Admiral Nimitz and his advisors recognized that intercepting the flight could eliminate Japan's most capable naval strategist, yet doing so risked exposing the code-breaking operation. President Roosevelt reportedly authorized the mission. American planners implemented elaborate deception measures to disguise the operation, attributing the successful interception to coast watchers. On April 18th, Yamamoto's plane was intercepted as predicted. Both bombers were shot down, eliminating Yamamoto and his staff. Despite the operational impact, Japanese forces implemented only minor, routine code modifications, failing to grasp that their communications had been compromised. By late 1942, JN-25 decryption had grown from an art into an industrial-scale operation. Station HYPO evolved into the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, occupying an entire floor of a modern facility at Pearl Harbor. IBM machines operated continuously in climate-controlled rooms, supporting a three-shift workforce of cryptanalysts, translators, and intelligence analysts. The process was highly systematic. Punch card operators, many recruited locally, keyed intercepted code groups at high speed. Machines sorted data to identify potential weaknesses, which cryptanalysts then exploited to recover new code sequences. Translators converted the results into English, while intelligence analysts synthesized multiple partial decrypts into actionable intelligence.
Quality control was rigorous. Recovered code groups were cross-checked against other messages, and translation disputes were resolved by committees of native Japanese speakers. Reports included confidence assessments, distinguishing confirmed facts from probabilistic interpretations. By January 1943, FRUPAC maintained millions of punch cards and ran daily millions of machine comparisons, consuming more electricity than a small city. Yet despite mechanization, human expertise remained essential. Linguistic intuition was necessary to identify common phrases in code groups, while operational knowledge enabled analysts to evaluate their strategic significance. Although Midway is widely remembered, the sustained campaign against Japan's merchant shipping, enabled entirely by code intelligence, represents the most profound and lasting impact of JN-25 decryption. By 1943, U.S. submarines were inflicting losses on Japanese shipping at a rate that outpaced the enemy's ability to replace vessels, effectively throttling an island nation heavily reliant on imported resources. The key factor behind this operational success was a significant intelligence advantage. Decrypted communications provided detailed information on convoy itineraries, ship cargoes, and protective escorts. Submarine commanders were directed to precise locations where unescorted tankers were scheduled to appear, an advantage the Japanese never suspected stemmed from code breaches. They attributed their mounting losses to the growing strength of the U.S. submarine fleet rather than flaws in their communication security. A notable example occurred in October 1944 when Commander Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang received a decoded message specifying the course of a convoy transporting aviation fuel from Borneo to the Philippines. Acting on this intelligence, Tang was perfectly positioned and destroyed 7 ships in a single might, critically restricting Japanese air operations during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Statistically, the impact of U.S. submarines was disproportionate to their numbers, less than 2% of Navy personnel, yet responsible for sinking over 30% of Japan's warships and 60% of its merchant fleet. The success was largely attributable to intelligence that disclosed not only locations, but also cargo contents and defensive arrangements. By late 1944, Japanese tanker losses had reached a point where naval vessels could not secure fuel. Training programs were halted due to aviation fuel shortages, and garrisons on outlying islands suffered from disrupted food supplies. The Japanese economy itself faltered as the flow of essential raw materials ceased. All of these consequences were driven by submarines operating under intelligence that the Japanese remained unaware had been compromised. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the pattern of code-derived advantages became undeniable. U.S. submarines intercepted convoys at their weakest points, aircraft carriers struck in areas Japanese planners assumed safe, and forces concentrated in response to attacks while leaving other regions exposed. Vice Admiral Yugaki Mate, who succeeded Admiral Yamamoto, recorded in his diary, "The enemy appears to anticipate our operations at every turn. Every maneuver is countered." Despite such insights, Japanese leadership did not undertake a thorough review of code security. While the Japanese Navy periodically updated JN-25, introducing new variants roughly semi-annually, these changes offered only brief interruptions in American code-breaking capabilities. JN-25C debuted on May 28, 1942, too late to avert the disaster at Midway, and JN-25D remained in use from August 1942 through March 1943. Each modification temporarily hindered American decoding efforts, but the underlying structure of the cipher remained, and analysts quickly adapted. Even direct evidence of code compromise failed to provoke significant Japanese response. In November 1943, a decoded U.S. intercept revealed the exact course of a convoy carrying reinforcements to Rabaul. U.S. destroyers intercepted the convoy, sinking every transport. Commander Kato Tetsuo, a communications officer who survived, reported that the Americans were waiting precisely at the point where we altered our route. They must have broken our codes. His observations were dismissed as fatigue-induced confusion, and he was reassigned to shore duty with instructions not to discuss the matter further. For the cryptanalysts who penetrated JN-25, success came with a profound ethical burden. Each decrypted message revealing the position of enemy ships corresponded directly to human casualties. Alva Laswell, a Marine translator, reflected privately on the impact of her work. Decoding Yamamoto's itinerary effectively signed his death warrant, knowledge that weighed heavily on her conscience. Analysts also faced particularly difficult dilemmas when intercepts identified hospital ships, prisoner transports, or refugee vessels. International law demanded protection for these ships, yet confirming their identity often required intelligence derived from the very codes whose secrecy had to be preserved. Some messages disclosed Japanese atrocities, but acting on them risked losing access to the entire code system. Thomas Dyer later recounted, "We intercepted communications detailing executions of prisoners. We were forced to archive them, knowing that revealing the information would destroy our intelligence source." The psychological strain on codebreakers manifested in varied ways. Some became obsessed with avoiding mistakes, knowing errors could cost American lives. Others developed a detached approach, treating decoded communications as technical problems rather than moral quandaries. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, aware that personnel acting on their guidance faced mortal danger while they remained removed from the front lines. Despite bureaucratic neglect and periodic internal skepticism, Station HYPO's achievements have been validated historically. Admiral Chester Nimitz remarked,
Without the intelligence provided by Rochefort and his team, the Pacific War would have extended by at least 2 years and resulted in hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. General Douglas MacArthur acknowledged that the Navy's codebreakers had given U.S. forces unprecedented situational awareness, effectively transforming the Pacific theater from a largely unknown expanse into a battlefield where enemy movements were anticipated and countered. Japanese military historians have concurred on the significance. Professor Tanaka Hiroshi of the Japanese Defense University observed, "The compromise of JN-25 inflicted consequences more severe than any single military defeat. Throughout the conflict, Japan faced an adversary who seemed omniscient, aware of every strategic and tactical decision we made." The true impact of Station HYPO's work is not measured solely by the victories it helped secure, but by the battles it prevented. By anticipating Japanese operations, American commanders could allocate forces strategically, leaving less critical regions lightly defended. This precision in resource management, made possible through intelligence, allowed the United States to wage a war on 2 oceans despite limitations in manpower and material, limitations that would have been insurmountable without the insights gained from codebreaking. Recognition for these accomplishments, however, was often delayed or denied. Joseph Rochefort's experience exemplifies this injustice. Though Admiral Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal, Admiral King vetoed the award. In October 1942, Rochefort was removed from operational command and reassigned to oversee a floating dry dock, a position far removed from the intelligence work where he excelled. He never received another assignment of significance. The medal was posthumously awarded only in 1986, a decade after Rochefort's death, with his son accepting it from President Reagan in a formal White House ceremony, a symbolic acknowledgement that could not undo decades of institutional oversight. The revelation of American cryptanalysis capabilities left an indelible impression on Japanese naval officers. During post-war interrogations, many initially rejected claims that their communications had been compromised until they were confronted with decrypted messages of their own. The psychological effect was profound. Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, former Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, remarked in 1949, "Had we known our messages were being read, our entire approach to the war would have been different. Our strategies, risks, and operations would have been fundamentally altered. We were essentially fighting blind." Captain Witsune Orihiko, former head of the Naval Intelligence Division, was even more blunt. "Failing to recognize that our codes were compromised was an unforgivable oversight." The signs of compromise were consistently present. American submarines appeared in precise positions, and carrier task forces operated where the Japanese least expected. Yet Japanese officers repeatedly attributed these outcomes to superior reconnaissance, rather than entertain the possibility of broken codes. This denial initiated a profound period of reflection in post-war Japanese military circles, raising the question of how a service that had successfully decrypted Russian communications decades earlier could fail so spectacularly to protect its own. The answer can be traced to technological lag, institutional rigidity, and cultural assumptions. The Japanese had not grasped the revolutionary potential of IBM tabulating machines. While their cryptographers relied on labor-intensive manual systems, American analysts harnessed electronic computation to process millions of code groups rapidly. This technological disparity was decisive. The ability to break JN-25 demonstrated that no cipher is inherently secure when sufficient intercepted material, computational resources, and analytical expertise converge. Moreover, it highlighted the persistent vulnerability posed by human operators, the inevitable shortcuts, repetitions, and predictable patterns introduced under stress.
The operational model devised for JN-25, integrating intercept stations, analytical centers, and distributed computational work, became the prototype for modern signals intelligence. It directly influenced the creation of the Five Eyes Alliance, linking the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in systematic intelligence collaboration. Ethical frameworks, first formalized at Station HYPO, emphasizing the protection of sources and methods even at tactical cost, remains central to intelligence practice today. The integration of signals intelligence with operational planning, pioneered by Rochefort and Nimitz, is now standard doctrine across modern militaries. JN-25 also illustrated that informational advantage can offset material inferiority. In June 1942, the Japanese Navy possessed superior ships, experienced personnel, and advanced weaponry. Yet thanks to code breaking, American forces, often outnumbered and outgunned, achieved decisive outcomes through superior intelligence. The Japanese experience serves as a cautionary tale. Overconfidence and failure to question assumptions can be as dangerous as any battlefield defeat. Technologies once thought secure can become vulnerable with innovation, whether through quantum computation or advanced artificial intelligence. Bureaucratic compartmentalization, which limited Japanese security assessments, mirrors contemporary organizational weaknesses that impede effective counterintelligence. Human factors, routine habits, predictable behavior, and complacency continue to be the Achilles heel of even the most sophisticated systems. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is psychological. The Japanese Navy could not conceive that their codes were penetrated because the idea contradicted deeply held beliefs about their own superiority. Every era sees analogous blind spots, where seemingly impossible threats are dismissed until they become real. The analysts in the Pearl Harbor basement, dismissed by Japanese intelligence as incapable of understanding JN-25, systematically undermined the Imperial Navy using mathematics and machines rather than conventional weapons. In 1985, surviving members of Station HYPO convened for their first and only reunion in San Antonio, Texas. Fewer than 30 attended, as age, distance, and mortality had claimed most of the original team. They met not as celebrated figures, but as elderly men whose most consequential contributions had largely gone unrecognized. Thomas Dyer, then 83, delivered the keynote. "We were mathematicians and linguists, not combatants. Our weapons were pencils and punch cards, not guns or aircraft. Yet we sank more Japanese vessels than any fleet and saved more lives than any medical unit. We were invisible then, and in many ways remain so." Joseph Finnegan, sober for 2 decades but still carrying emotional scars, reflected, "Every message we decrypted represented lives, Japanese sailors who would die, American pilots who would survive. Success came at the cost of others' lives. That reality never leaves you." The gathering's most moving moment was the tribute to Joe Rochefort, 9 years deceased, but remembered as their guiding spirit. His son accepted a flag that had flown over Pearl Harbor on June 4, 1982, the 40th anniversary of Midway, accompanied by a citation that read simply, "To the man who made victory possible." The scale and significance of American code-breaking efforts in the Pacific can be understood both through quantitative data and operational outcomes. At Station HYPO, a small team of 30 to 50 specialists operated during the critical period leading up to Midway, eventually growing to over 100 personnel at FRUPAC by late 1942. Across the Pacific Theater, the total number of cryptanalytic staff numbered 738 by December 1941, expanding to more than 5,000 by the conclusion of the war, supported by 5 principal processing centers. The technological backbone of this operation included IBM machines capable of handling millions of comparisons daily. Progress in deciphering the Japanese naval code JN-25 was incremental but decisive. In December 1941, only 10 to 15% of intercepted messages could be partially understood. By April 1942, analysts had achieved 20% readability, which climbed to 40% during the Battle of Midway in May. By December 1942, 60% of code groups were intelligible, and by war's end, most variants had nearly fully reconstructed.
The operational consequences were profound. At Midway, the United States sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers while losing only one of its own. American submarines also inflicted catastrophic losses on Japanese shipping, destroying 1,314 vessels, including merchant ships amounting to roughly 60% of Japan's commercial tonnage. Intelligence derived from code breaking likely saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. Meanwhile, Japanese counterintelligence failed to detect any breach of their communications, ignoring multiple warning signs that should have prompted a thorough review. Even after the assassination of Admiral Yamamoto, no systemic inquiry into potential code compromise was conducted. Post-war, many Japanese officers remained convinced that their communications had not been deciphered. The contrast in cryptographic approaches highlights the technological gap. The Japanese relied on printed code books and manual encryption methods, reflecting 19th century practices, while the Americans harnessed advanced computational resources. At Station HYPO, IBM tabulating machines, originally designed for business purposes, were modified to perform cryptanalytic operations. These devices could conduct thousands of pattern searches per hour, tasks that would have taken human teams months to accomplish. Although primitive by today's standards, these machines represented a revolutionary leap in wartime intelligence. Japanese overconfidence in the security of manual codes left them blind to the potential of mechanical analysis. They never developed machines equivalent to the German Enigma, never employed high-speed computation, and failed to recognize that sheer computational capacity could overcome mathematical complexity. By 1944, American cryptanalysts were experimenting with even more sophisticated methods. Early computers built from telephone switching components were used to attack codes with multiple layers of encryption. Photographic reproduction techniques accelerated the duplication of recovered code elements, and radio teletype networks allowed near-instantaneous dissemination of intelligence. Each technological innovation further widened the gap between Allied capabilities and Japanese assumptions about secure communication. Joe Rochefort passed away on July 20, 1976, at Little Company of Mary Hospital in Torrance, California. In his final hours, he spoke one last time, barely audible from his hospital bed. Reflecting on his wartime work, he expressed no bitterness, stating that the true reward was in the results: every message decrypted, every life spared. To him, the medals and honors were secondary. The work itself was recognition enough. Through meticulous analysis, a small team in a basement had outperformed entire fleets, shaping the course of the war not with guns and torpedoes, but with mathematics and intelligence. The broader lesson of the Pacific code-breaking campaigns is not merely technical, but strategic. Japanese confidence in their own superiority blinded them to the vulnerabilities inherent in complexity and tradition. They equated intricate systems with unassailable security and dismissed the power of innovation. The war demonstrated that intelligence, properly leveraged, can be far more decisive than firepower alone, and that the illusion of invulnerability is often the precursor to defeat. For 3 years, I immersed myself in the intercepted communications of Japanese naval leaders. The experience was unlike any other form of intelligence work. It created an uncanny familiarity with the enemy and comprehension of their strategies and vulnerabilities that surpassed their own self-awareness. From the confines of our secure stations, we observed the gradual unraveling of an empire, guided entirely by messages its commanders assumed were indecipherable. My foremost regret is not personal, but collective.
The extraordinary individuals who labored alongside me largely went unrecognized. These men were intellectual warriors, armed not with guns or ships, but with pencils, codebooks, and IBM tabulating machines. Their sacrifices and ingenuity deserve acknowledgement, yet much of history has overlooked them. The Japanese never suspected that their most critical naval code, JN-25, had been systematically compromised. Even decades later, some still find this difficult to accept. But we knew, and the responsibility that knowledge imposed was profound. From a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, we quietly influenced the course of history.
The effort to break JN-25 stands among the most significant intelligence triumphs of the 20th century. A relatively small cohort of American cryptanalysts, working with early computing devices and extraordinary persistence, dismantled the Japanese Navy's communications security. Over years of meticulous work, we decoded messages, identified operational plans, and provided actionable intelligence that ultimately reshaped the outcome of the Pacific War. The Japanese maintained unshakable confidence in JN-25, never suspecting that it had been fully penetrated. Their hubris and procedural weaknesses blinded them to repeated operational setbacks that had no apparent explanation. This misplaced faith in an allegedly secure system directly contributed to the loss of ships, territory, and ultimately the war itself. Recognition for the Americans who accomplished this feat was minimal at best. Commanders such as Joseph Rochefort faced professional ostracism despite their achievements, while the broader team remained dispersed, bound by the constraints of classified information for decades. Yet, in practical terms, their work decisively shaped the Pacific theater. The lessons of JN-25 resonate in the modern era, particularly as we navigate the complexities of digital encryption and quantum technologies. No security protocol is inherently unbreakable. Predictability, human error, and overconfidence remain critical vulnerabilities. Institutional blind spots that hindered Japan from acknowledging code compromise are not a relic of the past. They persist in contemporary organizations convinced of their own invulnerability. Station HYPO, once the epicenter of this effort, has since become little more than a storage facility. Its specialized IBM machines have long been retired or scrapped, and the individuals who operated them have largely faded from public memory. Nonetheless, their legacy endures in intelligence operations worldwide, in the decryption of enemy communications, and in the methodical application of analytic rigor that remains a cornerstone of modern cryptography. Throughout the conflict, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated under a complete misapprehension of our capabilities. They never suspected that their confidential communications were continuously intercepted and interpreted, nor that American analysts were shaping the battlefield by guiding naval deployments, submarine operations, and air campaigns. This ignorance directly facilitated decisive victories and contributed to the eventual collapse of Japan's strategic ambitions in the Pacific. Only after surrender did they grasp the extent of our penetration. By then, it was far too late. The story of JN-25 and those who decrypted it is a stark reminder. In intelligence, the gravest threat is often invisible. It is not the known adversary that imperils a nation, but the unknown observer silently reading every move. In the Pacific War, American cryptanalysts proved that patient, disciplined, and technically adept minds could alter the trajectory of global events without ever firing a shot. Their quiet triumph remains an enduring testament to the power of information and the consequences of misplaced trust in secrecy.